Lecture outline. Uh, Briefly recap last week's lecture. Last week, if you remember, we looked at interpreting Constitution, and in particular, we looked at two rules of interpreting Constitution. The first rule was the context rule, and the second rule, the purpose rule. In context rule, we looked at the entire context of the Constitution, the purpose, and in fact, to the reason why the Constitution was brought into force, and the intention of the Constitution. Today's topic, we will be looking at interpreting legislation. Topic outline, we look at statutory interpretation tools, then interpreting legislation, hierarchy of interpretational tools, and finally the common law principles of statutory interpretation. Learning outcomes, explain the purpose of the interpretational tools. You must know the various statutory interpretation tools and illustrate the characteristics of common law principles. Moving on to the next slide, statutory interpretation tools. There are two types of statutory interpretation tools in interpreting statutes: the primary tool and the secondary tools. The primary tool is the act itself. As you can see, the act itself, you have to look at the titles, the purpose, preamble, interpretation clauses, and finally the substantive provisions. This is the primary tool. On the other hand, moving on to the secondary tools, there are two secondary tools in external sources and common law principles, and under which you can see interpretation acts, other legislation, judicially defined legislation, dictionary, Hansard, treaties and conventions, law reform reports, etc. And under common law principles, literal rule, golden rule, mischief rule, purposive approach, and so forth. Moving on, you can see the interpretation legislation. First, you must look at the legislation itself. If the legislation does not define the word which is ambiguous, the meaning of the word or words or phrases, then you move on to the second tool, which is the interpretation act. If the act and the interpretation act does not give you any guidance as to the meaning of the word, then you move to the final rule, which is the principles of common law statutory rules. This is the hierarchy of the statutory interpretation tools. First, you look at the Interpretation Act, then the interpretation, the Act itself, Interpretation Act, and finally the principles of common law. If there is a conflict between the Act and Interpretation Act, then the interpretation, the Act will preside the Interpretation Act because it is more specific rather than general. On the other hand, if there is a conflict between substantive provision and the schedule will take precedence because the schedule is in more detail. The common law principles. What are the rules of statutory interpretation? Literal or plain meaning rule, golden rule, mischief rule, and the purpose rule. If the word is plain, unambiguous, take the word as they are. If there is misleading or two meanings, then you move to the golden rule. And finally, the court will look at the purpose of the legislation. These rules are encapsulated into two, literal and purpose rule.